Grace Holloway watched her name curl into ash while her stepsisters laughed beside the kitchen fire. The silver invitation had arrived at Holloway House just before dusk, carried in a black velvet pouch and sealed with the royal moon crest of King Alpha Adrian Blackwood. For one impossible moment, the whole house had gone silent. Even the old clock in the front hall seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa Holloway had snatched the pouch first, her polished fingers trembling beneath her perfect confidence, certain the letter must have been meant for her. Lydia leaned over her shoulder in a pale green silk dress, smiling before she had earned the right to smile. Their mother, Marjorie, stood beside them with her chin lifted, already imagining court doors opening, noble families bowing, and one of her daughters standing beneath the silver arches of the royal mating ceremony. Then Vanessa broke the seal. The smile vanished from her face. Lydia's lips parted. Marjorie's eyes narrowed. Because the name written in dark blue ink was not Vanessa. It was not Lydia. It was Grace Holloway. Grace stood in the kitchen doorway with flour still dusting her hands, her cream wool dress faded from washing, her light gray apron tied neatly over her waist. She was white-skinned with soft dark blonde hair pinned at the back of her neck, blue-gray eyes, and a face that had learned long ago not to reveal hope too quickly. For years she had moved through Holloway House like a quiet shadow, lighting fires before sunrise, washing dishes until her fingers ached, mending gowns she would never wear, and sleeping in the narrow attic room where winter wind slipped under the boards. After her father died, kindness became the only inheritance no one could lock away. She fed the barn cats. She left warm bread for old Elias Mercer when his hands shook too badly to carry trays. She spoke gently to horses, frightened children, and anyone else the house forgot how to treat softly. None of that had ever made Marjorie proud. None of it had ever made Vanessa or Lydia call her sister without cruelty in the word. Now the royal invitation had done what Grace never could. It had spoken her name out loud. Vanessa crossed the kitchen slowly, the silver-edged paper held between two fingers as if it were something dirty. "There must be a mistake," she said. Lydia gave a bright little laugh, thin as cracked glass. "The king's scribes must have confused the names." Grace did not answer. She only looked at the seal, at the moon crest pressed into silver wax, and felt something fragile open inside her chest. The royal mating ceremony was not an ordinary village dance. A moon-sealed invitation was sent only when the palace believed destiny had marked someone for the highest right. Grace had never imagined such a letter could enter the kitchen, much less carry her name. Marjorie took the invitation from Vanessa, read it once, then again, and her expression settled into something cold. "You will not attend." Grace's breath caught. "It has my name." "Your name," Vanessa said, stepping toward the stove, "is exactly the problem." Before Grace could move, Vanessa held the invitation over the open kitchen fire. Silver wax softened. Paper browned. The royal crest bent inward like a dying moon. Lydia watched with shining eyes while Marjorie said nothing. Grace's hands trembled at her sides, but she did not scream. She did not fight for the paper, because 3 pairs of eyes were waiting to turn her pain into entertainment. Her name darkened first, then folded, then disappeared into orange light. Vanessa smiled as ash lifted toward the chimney. "No king chooses ashes." Grace stared at the fire until the last silver edge collapsed. Outside, the packed chapel bell rang the evening hour, warning that the ceremony would begin before midnight. Inside, the kitchen smelled of smoke, bread, and something Grace could not name yet. Not defeat. Not exactly. Because even as the invitation burned, a strange warmth lingered beneath her skin, as if the moon had seen everything and had not looked away. The ash did not fall all at once. It floated in small gray pieces over the stove, soft and weightless, as if the royal invitation had never been powerful enough to change anything. Grace watched one blackened corner land near her shoe. A few minutes ago, her name had been written there in dark blue ink. Now it was only dust on the kitchen floor. Vanessa brushed her hands together with theatrical care, though the fire had not touched her. "There," she said. "Problem solved." Lydia tilted her head, her pale green silk sleeves catching the stove light. "If anyone asks, we will say no invitation ever came for you. That will be easier for everyone." Grace looked from one stepsister to the other, then to Marjorie, who stood near the table with the calm of someone arranging flowers rather than destroying a future. "You know it was real," Grace said softly. Her voice did not shake, and that seemed to annoy them more than tears would have. Marjorie's mouth tightened. "Real does not mean appropriate." She stepped closer, her dark dress whispering across the kitchen floor. "A royal ceremony is not a place for a kitchen omega in a worn-out apron. You would embarrass this family before every noble pack in the north." Grace swallowed. The old pain moved through her quietly, familiar enough that it knew where to settle. Holloway House had once belonged to her father's laughter, her mother's garden songs, and warm dinners where no one had counted how many slices of bread she took. After her father died, the rooms grew colder even in summer. Marjorie moved Grace into the attic, gave Vanessa and Lydia the front bedrooms, and said grief was no excuse for idleness. So Grace learned to rise before dawn. She learned the rhythm of the house by labor. Fires first, then water, then breakfast, then laundry, then mending, then sweeping the stairs her stepsisters descended in satin shoes. She learned that cruelty often wore perfume and spoke in polished sentences. She also learned that if she let bitterness fill every empty place, there would be nothing left of her mother inside her. So she chose small mercies where she could. She left scraps for the barn cats. She warmed Elias Mercer's tea before his cough worsened. She set aside soft carrots for the oldest mare when the stable boys forgot. She listened when village children came to the back gate with scraped knees and frightened faces. Grace owned almost nothing, but she could still give gentleness. That was the one thing Marjorie had never managed to take. Vanessa picked up a silver hair comb from the table and turned toward the hallway mirror. "Lydia, help me with my cloak. We cannot be late because of this nonsense." Lydia smiled at Grace as she passed. "You should be grateful. Imagine standing in that palace and realizing no one wanted you there." Grace bent down and gathered the fallen ash with a cloth before any of them could see her fingers tremble. The blackened dust smeared faintly against her skin. For reasons she could not explain, warmth pulsed once beneath it, like moonlight remembered by touch. She looked at her palm, but there was only soot. Marjorie noticed. "Wash that off. Then finish the bread, polish the front lamps and lay out the traveling gloves. Elias will lock the back corridor when we leave." Grace looked up quickly. "Lock it?" Vanessa laughed from the doorway. "We cannot have you wandering after us with some dramatic little story." Lydia added, "The ceremony will be full of real candidates. Stay where you belong." The words entered Grace quietly, but they did not stay quietly. Something inside her, something very small and long buried, lifted its head. She wanted to say that her name had been on the invitation, that the moon-sealed crest had chosen her kitchen doorway over their polished front hall, that paper could burn but truth should not. Instead she stood, folded the ash-stained cloth in her hand, and looked at Marjorie. "I will finish the bread," she said. Marjorie seemed satisfied. They always mistook obedience for surrender. For the next hour, Holloway House filled with the rustle of silk, the snap of cloak clasps, the scent of rose oil and ambition. Vanessa descended in silver satin, Lydia in pale green, both shining like girls from a story that had been stolen and rewritten without Grace in it. Marjorie inspected them with pride, then looked at Grace only long enough to say, "Do not open the door for anyone." The front door closed. Wheels rolled over the frozen drive. Hooves faded toward the palace road. Then a key turned in the back corridor lock, and Holloway House sank into silence. Grace stood alone in the kitchen, flour on her sleeves, ash on her palm, and the ceremony beginning miles away without her. She should have felt empty. Instead, from somewhere beyond the window, in the cold dark near the woodpile, came a tiny, desperate scratch. Grace held her breath and listened. The scratch came again, faint and uneven, followed by a sound so small it might have been swallowed by the wind if the house had not been so still. Holloway House was never truly quiet when her stepfamily was home. There were always footsteps above, drawers opening, Lydia humming to herself, Vanessa calling for someone to bring gloves she had forgotten in plain sight. But now every room stood empty, and the tiny sound outside the kitchen window seemed to reach directly into the hollow place where the invitation had burned. Grace crossed to the window and wiped steam from the glass with her sleeve. Beyond the pane, the yard lay silver beneath a thin crust of snow. The woodpile leaned against the fence, dark and jagged, and beside it something small moved once, then went still. Grace looked toward the locked back corridor. Marjorie had made certain she could not reach the main yard. But the old pantry door beneath the side stairs had warped years ago and never closed properly in winter. Elias knew it. Grace knew it. Marjorie did not, because Marjorie rarely noticed doors used by servants unless she wanted them shut. Grace took a lantern from the shelf, wrapped her gray wool scarf around her shoulders, and slipped through the pantry passage into the cold. Snow bit through her thin shoes immediately. She crossed the yard quickly, lifting her skirt above the frozen mud, the lantern flame trembling in her hand. Near the woodpile, curled against a split log, was a wolf pup no larger than a house cat, its fur pale gray under the snow, its ears flattened, its tiny body shaking with cold. A narrow silver ribbon was tied loosely around its neck, marked with a royal crest so small Grace almost missed it. Her heart tightened. "Oh, little one," she whispered. The pup opened its eyes. They were dark and frightened but not wild. Not dangerous. Just lost. Grace knelt in the snow and held out her hand, palm up, the same hand still faintly stained with ash from the invitation. The pup sniffed once, then pressed its nose into her fingers with a tired little sigh. Something warm moved beneath Grace's skin again, gentler this time, as if the soot on her palm remembered moonlight. She did not understand it, and there was no one kind enough in the house to ask. So she did what she understood best. She helped. Grace wrapped the pup in her gray wool scarf, tucking the soft fabric around its paws. The silver ribbon brushed against the ash on her hand, and a faint shimmer passed over the royal crest before fading. Grace froze for a second, staring. Then the pup shivered, and wonder gave way to urgency. She carried it back through the pantry door, shut out the wind with her shoulder, and brought it to the kitchen hearth. The fire had burned low, but she coaxed it back with kindling and patience. Soon the room filled with a soft orange glow, touching the flour on the table, the blackened cloth folded near the stove, and the empty place where the invitation had been. Grace warmed a little milk in an iron pan, added a pinch of calming herb, and dipped a clean cloth into it. The pup lapped weakly, then stronger, while Grace stroked its damp fur with 2 fingers. "There you are," she murmured. "No one will leave you outside tonight." The words settled over the kitchen like a promise meant for both of them. Far away, the royal mating ceremony would be beginning under silver arches and crystal lights. Vanessa would be smiling as if she had never watched a name burn. Lydia would be pretending innocence came naturally. Marjorie would be standing tall among noble mothers, certain she had buried Grace where destiny could not reach her. Grace looked down at the small royal creature asleep in her scarf beside the hearth, its nose tucked against the ash-stained edge of the wool. She should have been at the palace. Instead, she was locked in a kitchen, feeding a lost pup by firelight. Yet for the first time since the invitation burned, Grace felt the strange warmth in her palm spread quietly through her chest. The ceremony might have been miles away, but something royal had still found its way to her door. At Blackwood Palace, the royal mating ceremony began beneath arches of silver birch and moon-white silk, but the room felt wrong before the first name was spoken. King Alpha Adrian Blackwood stood at the head of the grand hall in a black ceremonial coat clasped with silver, his dark brown hair swept back from a face carved by discipline, his ice-blue eyes moving over the gathered candidates without warmth or cruelty. He was a white-skinned ruler in his early 30s, powerful enough to silence noble houses with a glance, but tonight his stillness came from something deeper than authority. The moon-sealed rite was supposed to answer when the chosen soul entered the room. It was supposed to stir like light beneath his skin, a quiet pull from blood, spirit, and destiny. Instead, the mark on his wrist remained cold. Vanessa Holloway entered with confidence polished to a shine, her silver gown catching every candle flame as if the light belonged to her. Lydia followed in pale green silk, soft-eyed and smiling, every movement carefully sweet. Marjorie walked behind them with the proud lift of a mother certain she had arranged the future properly. To most of the hall, they looked like worthy daughters of a northern pack house. To Adrian they looked like a beautifully wrapped silence. The royal scribe lifted the invitation register and began calling the moon-sealed names. Each invited guest stepped forward, placed a hand above the silver basin, and waited for the glow that would prove the bond had answered. Some glimmers rose faintly for lesser matches. Some names passed with polite nods. Then the scribe paused. "Grace Holloway," he read. The hall waited. No one stepped forward. Adrian's gaze sharpened. Vanessa's smile did not break, but one hand tightened against her skirt. Lydia lowered her eyes too quickly. Marjorie leaned toward the nearest attendant and whispered something about illness, but Adrian had spent years listening to lies wrapped in respectable voices. He knew the shape of them. "Call the name again," he said. The scribe obeyed. "Grace Holloway." Still no one came. The silver basin did not glow. The air above it stayed clear and empty. Adrian felt the cold mark on his wrist pulse once, not with recognition but with absence. It was the ache of a door left unopened. "Who represents the Holloway household?" he asked. Marjorie stepped forward at once, graceful and controlled. "Your Majesty, my stepdaughter is unwell. She could not attend. My daughters came in her place to honor the invitation." Adrian looked at Vanessa, then Lydia. "A moon-sealed invitation cannot be honored by replacement." Vanessa dipped into a practiced curtsy. "Of course, Your Majesty. We only wished to show respect." Respect. The word fell beautifully and landed falsely. Adrian turned to his scribe. "Bring the sealed copy." A murmur crossed the hall. The scribe hurried to the record table and returned with a narrow black case containing the palace duplicate of the invitation. Adrian broke the outer ribbon and studied the edge of the preserved envelope. There, along one corner, was the faintest trace of gray ash, as if the twin magic of the original had recoiled from flame. His wrist mark warmed for the first time that night, then flickered out again. Adrian lifted his eyes slowly. "Where is Grace Holloway?" Marjorie's face remained calm, but her scent sharpened with fear. Before she could answer, a small commotion stirred near the open side doors. A pale gray wolf pup padded into the hall on unsteady feet, wrapped in a gray wool scarf that did not belong to the palace. Snow clung to its paws. Ash marked the scarf's edge. Adrian went still. The pup crossed the polished floor past nobles, guards, silk gowns, and silver candles, ignoring them all until it reached the foot of the dais and looked up at him. Adrian knelt and touched the scarf. Warmth traveled from the wool into the mark on his wrist, gentle but undeniable. Beneath smoke, snow, and kitchen fire, he found the scent the ceremony had been missing. Not Vanessa. Not Lydia. Grace. Adrian stood, the scarf in his hand and the truth already leading him away from the hall. "The ceremony is suspended," he said. "The one who was called is not here." Then, before midnight could pass, the King Alpha walked out of his own royal right to follow the scent of ash and kindness back to a kitchen door. The road from Blackwood Palace to Holloway House ran 6 miles through snow-dusted pine and moonlit fields, but Adrian Blackwood did not feel the cold. He rode at the front of the royal escort with the gray wool scarf folded carefully in one hand, the pale wolf pup sleeping safely against the cloak of a trusted guard behind him. The ceremony music had faded far behind them, along with the shocked whispers of nobles, the strained politeness of Marjorie Holloway, and the false smiles of her daughters. None of it mattered now. The mark on Adrian's wrist warmed each time the scarf shifted in his hand, not blazing, not commanding, but pulsing with a quiet certainty that made every mile feel like a question being answered. Ash clung to the wool near one corner. Beneath it lingered the scent of kitchen fire, flour, winter herbs, and a kindness so steady it unsettled him more than beauty ever could. He had stood in royal halls all his life. He had watched candidates arrive wrapped in silk and ambition, watched noble families polish their daughters into offerings, watched elders speak of destiny as if it could be arranged through bloodlines and gold. But the moon had ignored the silver gowns. It had ignored the polished names. It had answered a scarf from a locked kitchen. At Holloway House, Grace sat beside the hearth with the pup's empty basket near her feet, unaware that the palace had changed direction because of her. She had finished the bread because habit was a stubborn thing, and then she had washed the soot from her hands until only a faint gray mark remained beneath one fingernail. The house was still locked from the outside. The front room slept in darkness. Upstairs, the attic waited with its thin blanket and slanted ceiling, but Grace had not gone to bed. Something in her chest would not settle. She kept seeing the silver invitation bending into flame. She kept hearing Vanessa's voice saying no king chooses ashes. Yet the little wolf pup had come to her covered in snow, and for a brief hour, the kitchen had felt less like a prison and more like a place destiny had found by mistake. Grace was mending the hem of her cream wool dress by candlelight when the first knock came. It was not loud, but it was deep enough to move through the old wood and into her bones. She looked toward the back door. No one used the kitchen entrance at midnight except servants, and every servant had gone with the family or been sent away early. The knock came again. Grace rose slowly, needle still between her fingers. "Who is there?" she called. A man's voice answered from the other side, low, controlled, and unfamiliar. Someone who followed a gray wool scarf. Grace's breath caught. She crossed the kitchen, lifted the small curtain beside the door, and saw torchlight shining on black cloaks, silver clasps, and horses standing silent in the snow. At the center of it all stood a tall white-skinned man in a black royal coat, dark brown hair swept back, ice blue eyes fixed not on the grand front of Holloway House, but on the kitchen door where Grace stood hidden behind glass. Her fingers tightened around the curtain. She knew the crest on his chest before her mind allowed his name. King Alpha Adrian Blackwood. The door was locked from the outside, but the warped pantry latch beside it had never obeyed Marjorie's rules. Grace slipped through the narrow side passage and opened the kitchen door with trembling hands. Cold air entered first, then silence. Adrian looked at her as if the entire royal hall had been only a road leading to this one small room. He did not bow like a courtier. He did not stare like a noble measuring worth. He simply held up the gray wool scarf, its edge still marked with ash, and asked, "Are you the Omega who wrapped my messenger in this?" Grace looked at the scarf, then at the royal crest above his heart, then back to his eyes. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. It was cold. Something softened in Adrian's face. Not pity, not surprise, but recognition. Behind him, the guard carefully lowered the wolf pup, now awake and bundled, and the tiny creature padded straight past the King Alpha into Grace's kitchen. It pressed its nose against her skirt with a happy sigh. Adrian watched it choose her without hesitation. "The palace called your name tonight," he said. Grace felt the word strike the place where hope had tried not to live. "My invitation was burned." Adrian's eyes lowered to the ash-stained scarf in his hand. "Paper burns," he said quietly. "A true name does not." Grace should have answered him. She should have stepped aside, bowed her head, or found some proper sentence for the impossible fact that the King Alpha was standing at the kitchen door while her stepsisters were still at the palace pretending she did not exist. But the words would not come. The wolf pup pressed against her skirt, warm and alive, as if it had already decided where safety lived. Adrian Blackwood remained outside the threshold, snow resting on the shoulders of his black royal coat, the gray wool scarf folded in his hands. He did not enter without permission. That was the first thing Grace noticed after the shock. Men with power usually crossed rooms as if every door had been built for them. Adrian waited in the cold. "May I come in?" he asked. Grace looked behind her at the kitchen with its cooling bread, patched curtains, clean but worn table, and the ash cloth folded near the stove. It was not a room meant to receive a king. Then again, nothing about tonight had followed the rules of rooms. She stepped back. "Yes, Your Majesty." Adrian entered with only one guard, leaving the others outside with the horses. The guard carried the pup's small travel blanket and set it near the hearth without speaking. Grace closed the door against the wind, suddenly aware of every humble thing around her. The chipped cup near the basin, the flower on her sleeve, the old hem she had been mending by candlelight. Adrian's gaze moved across the room, not with disgust, but with a careful sadness that made her straighten her shoulders. "You were locked in," he said softly. It was not a question. Grace touched the edge of her apron. The back corridor was locked. The pantry door sticks in winter. The guard's eyes shifted toward the outside lock, but Adrian lifted one hand, stopping any immediate command. His attention stayed on Grace. "Who burned the invitation?" The kitchen seemed to shrink around the question. Grace heard Vanessa laughing again, saw silver wax melting, felt Marjorie's silence settle like a stone. For a moment she wanted to protect herself the old way, with half-truths and lowered eyes. Then the pup sighed beside the hearth, wrapped in the scarf she had given it, and Grace realized that kindness had already carried her name farther than fear ever had. "Vanessa held it over the fire," she said. Lydia watched. Marjorie allowed it. Adrian's face did not change dramatically. That made the cold in his eyes more powerful, not less. "And they told the palace you were ill." Grace gave a faint, tired smile. That was generous. Here, they mostly said I was not appropriate. Adrian looked at the cream wool dress she had mended too many times, the gray apron, the hands marked by work and soot. A moon-sealed invitation is not sent for decoration, he said. It is sent because the right has already heard something the court has not yet seen. Grace did not know what to do with that. Compliments had always been traps in Holloway House, bait before ridicule. Adrian seemed to understand the way silence folded around her. He placed the scarf gently on the table, ash-marked edge visible beneath the candlelight. I will ask you this plainly, Grace Holloway. Were you kept from attending by choice? Hearing her full name in his voice nearly undid her. Not girl. Not kitchen omega. Not stepdaughter. Grace Holloway. She lifted her eyes to his. No, the answer was small, but it did not bend. Before Adrian could speak again, the sound of wheels and hooves rushed into the front drive. Grace's body went still. The wolf pup lifted its head. Outside, women's voices rose in panic, sharp and breathless. Vanessa. Lydia. Marjorie. Adrian turned slightly toward the hall, his expression calm as winter stone. Then let them enter, he said. Grace looked at the ash on the scarf, then at the door her family had locked from the outside. For the first time in years, she did not step back into the corner when their voices came near. The front door opened with a force that made the old walls of Holloway House seem to flinch, and Marjorie's voice cut through the hall before her footsteps reached the kitchen. Grace. It was the voice she used when something had gone wrong, and someone smaller had to be blamed for it. Vanessa entered first, still dressed in silver satin, her auburn hair pinned with pearls, her cheeks flushed from cold and fear. Lydia followed in pale green silk, eyes wide, one hand pressed dramatically to her chest as if she were the injured party. Marjorie came last, wrapped in dark velvet and anger, but all three stopped the moment they saw King Alpha Adrian Blackwood standing beside the kitchen table. The royal guard waited near the hearth. The wolf pup lay in the gray wool scarf beside the fire. The ash-marked cloth rested in candlelight like a witness. For the first time Grace could remember, no one in her family knew what to say. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Mrs. Holloway, he said, you told my court Grace Holloway was too ill to attend the ceremony. Marjorie recovered fastest. She lowered herself into a careful curtsy, elegant even in panic. Your Majesty, there has been a misunderstanding. Grace is delicate. We thought it best not to expose her to the cold. Vanessa nodded quickly. She often imagines things, Your Majesty. She becomes emotional. Lydia added, soft and trembling. We only wanted to protect the family from embarrassment. Grace felt the old reflex rise in her body, the instinct to become smaller, quieter, less costly. Their lives were familiar enough to feel almost safe, because at least she knew how those rooms ended. But Adrian looked at her before answering them, not because he needed permission to speak, but because he wanted to know whether she was still standing inside herself. Grace lifted her chin. The movement was slight. To her it felt enormous. Adrian turned back to the three women. Protection does not require a locked corridor. Marjorie's face paled. Vanessa's eyes flicked toward the kitchen door. Adrian placed the gray wool scarf on the table beside the remaining silver wax. My messenger found Grace after the invitation was burned. The scent on this scarf led me here. The royal duplicate bears an ash trace from the original flame. The invitation was moon-sealed. It could not be mistaken, exchanged, or honored by another daughter. Lydia's sweet mask trembled. We did not know. A quiet voice answered from the hallway. Yes, you did. Everyone turned. Elias Mercer stood beneath the kitchen arch, wrapped in his old brown coat, one hand gripping the doorframe for balance. His white hair was windblown, his face pale from the cold, but his eyes were clear. Grace's breath caught. Elias. The old servant looked at her with apology folded into every line of his face. I saw the letter when it arrived, child. I saw your name. I should have spoken sooner. Marjorie hissed. Elias, you are confused. Adrian's eyes cooled. Be very careful before you call truth confusion in front of me. The room went still. Elias stepped fully into the kitchen. The invitation read Grace Holloway. Vanessa burned it. Lydia watched. Mrs. Holloway ordered the back corridor locked before they left for the palace. Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. Not because the truth hurt, but because hearing someone else carry it felt like setting down a weight she had forgotten was crushing her. Vanessa's composure broke into sharp desperation. She is a kitchen omega. She would never belong at court. Grace opened her eyes. This time she answered before Adrian could. They burned the invitation, she said, her voice quiet but clear. But they did not burn my name. Adrian looked at her then, and something warm moved through the room, not from the hearth, not from the candles, but from being seen without having to beg. He turned to Marjorie, Vanessa, and Lydia. No, he said. And they did not burn what the moon already knew. The wolf pup lifted its head as if recognizing the words. Grace stood beside the kitchen table in her faded dress and gray apron, with flour on her sleeve and ash beneath one fingernail, and for the first time, Holloway House did not feel larger than she was. Grace expected the room to erupt after Adrian spoke, but the silence that followed was worse for the people who had built their lives on controlling the story. Vanessa stood in silver satin with her hands curled at her sides, no longer looking like a future court favorite, only a woman whose polished lies had been brought into kitchen light. Lydia stared at the floor, pale green silk trembling softly around her knees. Marjorie's face had gone still in the dangerous way Grace knew too well, but this time the danger had nowhere to land. Adrian did not give anger a stage. He simply turned to the royal guard and said, "Record Elias Mercer's testimony and seal the remaining wax, the scarf, and the duplicate invitation as evidence for the council." The guard bowed and began with quiet efficiency. Marjorie took 1 step forward. "Your Majesty, surely there is no need to involve the council over a family misunderstanding." Adrian looked at the locked corridor door, then at Grace's apron, then at the ash-marked scarf beside the sleeping pup. A moon-sealed invitation was destroyed. A royal right was disrupted. An omega was confined and denied her own name. That is not a family misunderstanding. Grace felt the words settle over the kitchen, each one restoring shape to what had been made small. Still, when Adrian turned toward her, his voice changed. It lost the edge of judgment and became careful. "Grace Holloway, you are not required to leave this house tonight because I came here." Vanessa's head snapped up. Lydia looked startled. Even Grace did not understand at first. Adrian continued, standing a respectful distance from her. "You are not a prize reclaimed from them. You are not an apology I can carry back to the palace and call justice. The choice must be yours." Grace looked around the kitchen. The chipped cups. The bread cooling on the table. The hearth she had cleaned every morning. The attic stairs beyond the hall. The room had been her cage for so long that some tired part of her had mistaken its shape for safety. Elias watched her with tears shining in his old eyes. The wolf pup yawned in the gray scarf, warm and unafraid. Marjorie's voice softened into the tone she used when cruelty wanted to dress itself as concern. "Grace, think carefully. Palace life is not kind to girls like you. Here at least you know your place." Grace looked at her stepmother, and for the first time, the sentence did not fold her inward. Here she knew her place. That was true. Her place had been beside the stove, behind locked doors, beneath names that were spoken louder than hers. But knowing a cage did not make it a home. Grace untied the gray apron from her waist and set it on the table. The gesture was small, almost silent, yet Vanessa inhaled as if Grace had shattered something expensive. "My mother's prayer book is upstairs," Grace said. Her own voice sounded calm enough to surprise her. "And my winter shawl." Adrian nodded once. "Take what belongs to you." Marjorie stiffened. "Those things are Holloway property." Elias stepped forward before Grace could answer. "No, ma'am. They were her mother's." Adrian's gaze did not leave Marjorie. "They will go with her." No one argued after that. Grace climbed the narrow stairs to the attic alone because she needed to leave that room by her own strength. She packed the small prayer book with pressed lavender between its pages, a folded winter shawl, and a wooden comb her father had carved years before. Nothing more. When she returned, the kitchen looked the same and completely different. Adrian stood by the door, not reaching for her bag, not hurrying her, not turning choice into command. Grace looked once at Vanessa, Lydia, and Marjorie. "You burned the invitation," she said softly. "Boo." The snow outside Holloway House did not feel like punishment beneath Grace's feet. It felt clean, cold, and startlingly quiet, as if the whole world had paused to watch her cross the threshold she had once believed she would never escape. She carried one small bag, her mother's prayer book pressed safely inside, her winter shawl folded over her arm, and the gray wool scarf wrapped around the royal wolf pup now sleeping against a guard's cloak. Adrian Blackwood walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, his black coat marked with silver moonlight, his ice-blue eyes lowered to the path so she would not feel studied. At the gate, Grace turned back once. Holloway House stood tall and dark against the snow, every window cold except the kitchen, where the fire still glowed behind the glass. For years, that room had been the place where her name was made small. Now it looked small itself. Elias Mercer stood in the doorway, one hand over his heart, and Grace lifted her fingers in farewell. She did not wave to Marjorie. She did not look for Vanessa or Lydia behind the curtains. Some doors did not need to be slammed to be left forever. At Blackwood Palace, no one asked Grace to enter through the servants' hall. Adrian brought her through the eastern entrance, where silver lanterns burned low and the night guards bowed not because she was dressed richly, but because the King Alpha had spoken her name with honor. A quiet chamber was prepared for her near the women's guest wing, warm with a small hearth, clean linen, a writing desk, and a window facing the moon garden. Grace stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to step inside. The room was not grand by palace standards, but it was the first space in years that no one had assigned to her as a punishment. Adrian noticed her hesitation and stopped several feet away. "This room is yours for as long as you choose to remain," he said. "The door locks from the inside." Grace looked at him then, and something in her chest loosened with a pain so gentle it almost became relief. The council hearing began 3 days later. Elias testified. The royal scribe presented the duplicate invitation, the ash-marked scarf, the remaining silver wax, and the account of the messenger pup. Marjorie tried to polish the truth until it looked like concern, but concern could not explain a burned moon-sealed invitation or a locked corridor. Vanessa's pride collapsed into silence. Lydia wept without answering the questions clearly. The council ruled that Grace's invitation had been destroyed deliberately, her attendance had been prevented, and the royal mating ceremony would be repeated with Grace present only if she wished to stand there. That last part mattered most. Not if Adrian wished it. Not if the court demanded it. If Grace wished. In the weeks that followed, Grace learned the palace slowly. She helped in the healing rooms by choice, reading herb notes beside older healers who treated her hands as skilled instead of lowly. She walked the moon garden in the evenings, where the little gray messenger pup often followed at her heels. Adrian did not crowd her. He sent updates about the council, asked whether her chamber was warm enough, and always knocked before entering any room where she stood. Power, Grace discovered, could be quiet when it was held by someone who did not need to prove it. When the moon-sealed ceremony was held again, the great hall was not crowded with hungry ambition. It was calm, silver, and open. Grace wore a simple cream gown with her mother's wooden comb in her dark blonde hair. She walked to the center by herself. Adrian stood beneath the silver birch arch, crowned but humble, his wrist mark glowing faintly beneath his cuff. He did not call her forward like a possession. He asked clearly enough for every noble house to hear, "Grace Holloway, do you choose to stand here?" Grace looked at the silver basin, then at the king who had come to her kitchen door, then at the moonlight falling like a blessing over the floor. "Yes," she said. "This time I came because I chose to." The basin filled with soft light, gentle as snow under the moon. Adrian's mark answered. Warmth rose in Grace's palm where ash had once stained her skin, and she understood then that destiny had never been lost in the fire. It had simply refused to enter a room where she was not free. Adrian bowed his head, waiting for her next step, and Grace smiled through the tears she no longer needed to hide. Her stepsisters had burned the invitation, but destiny had not needed paper. It had known the way to the kitchen door, and it had waited until Grace was ready to walk through it by her own choice.